This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is something quieter and more dangerous. A system built to resist impulse is being trained, piece by piece, to obey it. Not by decree, by repetition, by testing what bends, by watching what stays silent. If you felt lately like the rules are still on the books but somehow not on the job, you're not imagining it. Because the warning isn't a single incident. It's the pattern that forms when the same kind of pressure shows up in places that are supposed to be separate. And here's the problem. Once that pattern locks in, it doesn't need chaos to function. It runs on routine. So stay with me. Subscribe if you want these breakdowns. Because what comes next is how you recognize the mechanism before it becomes the weather. What controls the system now is not ideology. It's leverage, the ability to make consequences appear fast while accountability appears slow. That's the trade. Force moves at the speed of an order. Oversight moves at the speed of a calendar. Courts, committees, procedures, reviews, months, years. And once you understand that gap, you see the real center of gravity. Not personalities, not daily drama, the takeover of tempo. Because if you can accelerate the parts of government that punish and stall the parts that investigate, you don't need to rewrite the Constitution. You just outrun it. That's why this story keeps popping up in places that are supposed to be independent. Law enforcement that's supposed to answer to law, institutions that are supposed to answer to data, a press that's supposed to answer to the public. When those three start moving in the same direction, it stops being politics. It becomes infrastructure. And the next piece is the one that was easiest to miss because it happened slowly. There was a before, and it wasn't perfect, but it had friction. Before, the most aggressive powers of the state came with social cost, a visible cost, a career cost, a legal risk. Before, even when officials crossed lines, they tended to pretend the line mattered. Now the shift is subtler. The line is treated like a suggestion. And the real test is not, is it lawful? It's, will anyone stop it in time? That's how normalization works. Not with one dramatic announcement, with repetition that dulls the alarm system. One extraordinary act happens, then another. Then the argument becomes procedural, technical, exhausting. And while everyone debates the wording, the posture changes. You can feel it in the way federal power is talked about now. Less like a limited tool, more like a permanent stance, a readiness, an expectation. And once readiness becomes the default, the next shock doesn't arrive as a surprise. It arrives as proof. Which brings us to the first concrete jolt in your material. Brutal, specific, and very revealing. Early 2026. A woman in her car, a federal agent, a shot to the face, she dies. And then something almost as instructive happens right after. The official story rushes out, confident, clean, convenient, and it collapses against video. In a functioning system, that gap between a lethal act and an immediate false account triggers automatic weight. Internal alarms, external scrutiny, a reluctance to speak until facts are stable. But here, the speed matters more than the truth. Because speed is the shield. Say it first. Flood the zone. Force everyone else into defense mode. And watch who reacts. Because in your reference, the striking detail isn't only the killing, it's the asymmetry of outrage afterward. How quickly some institutions avert their eyes. How easily the public is asked to move on. If you want to understand the larger danger, don't look at this as a standalone tragedy. Look at it as a systems test. Subscribe if you're tracking this with me, because the next question is the one that decides everything. What happens when the same logic reaches the parts of government that control money? Here's the hidden mechanism. When power is under political time pressure, it starts converting institutions into instruments. Not because every official becomes a villain, because the incentives change. If you're facing a calendar, 8 months to an election, then the goal becomes short-term appearance. Stability now, relief now, numbers that look good now, even if the cost is deferred, outsourced, or invisible. That's why an independent institution is such a threat, because independence is delay. Independence is a no. Independence is a refusal to perform on command. So the move is predictable. You don't debate the policy. You attack the referee. You don't argue about the data. You undermine the person holding the data. You don't adjust to constraints. You try to remove the constraint. In your material, that's the pivot from coercive force to economic force. Pressure on the central bank. attempts to oust members, moves toward the chair. And here's the truly systemic part. The people who benefit are the ones who can surf the short-term boost. Asset holders, incumbents, insiders. The damage is absorbed by everyone else later, quietly through prices, instability, and lost trust. That's the deal. And once you see the deal, the next escalation stops looking random, because the next tool isn't bullets or interest rates. It's fear, delivered through investigation. Now the pace changes. A central bank gets targeted, not with debate, with removal. A reporter gets raided, not with questions, with seizure. Rules that restrained investigators get loosened, not by Congress, by internal policy shift. And every one of these moves carries the same message. You can be next, because that's how selective power works. It doesn't need to prosecute everyone. It only needs to make examples at unpredictable intervals so everyone else recalculates. And the most destabilizing part is the blur. Was it lawful? Was it normal? Was it an exception? Or is this the new baseline? That uncertainty is not a bug. It's the feature. It forces institutions to hesitate. It forces leaders to bargain with themselves. It forces citizens to shrink their expectations. And when hesitation becomes the norm, the system doesn't need formal permission to change. It changes by default. So the question isn't just what happened to one person or one agency or one newsroom. The question is, what happens when the country learns, slowly, that the cost of speaking is rising? And if you think that doesn't touch you, that's the next part. Here's where it reaches you. Because when enforcement becomes a posture and investigations become a warning, daily life starts to narrow. Not in one dramatic moment, in small decisions. You don't go to something. You don't post something. You don't call attention to something at work. You tell yourself it's not worth the hassle. And that's rational, because the system is teaching you a lesson. Consequences are fast. Clarification is slow. Meanwhile, the economy doesn't become kinder under this. It becomes more volatile. If independent policy is treated like a lever for political survival, you absorb it through prices, rent, borrowing costs, job insecurity. You don't get a press conference explaining the trade-off. You get the bill. And the most corrosive part is how lonely it can feel, like you're the only one noticing the pattern. You're not. If you want to keep tracking this with me, subscribe, share this. Keep your place in the story. Because the next turn is what happens when selective resistance shows up, late, uneven, and for self-interested reasons. And that's when the system really starts to slip. Now it stops being local. Because when a country that anchors global finance starts treating independence as optional, everyone else has to price that in, not as a theory, as risk. Markets don't vote. They don't care about speeches. They respond to credibility, whether rules hold, when pressure hits. So if the signal goes out that key institutions can be leaned on, investigated, or replaced to produce short-term political optics, the ripple isn't moral panic. It's recalculation. Borrowing gets more expensive, capital gets more skittish, allies get quieter, adversaries get bolder, and the spillover isn't only economic. If aggressive state power is normalized domestically, if enforcement expands and oversight lags, other governments learn. They copy the playbook. Or they exploit the distraction. That's why the separate stories frame is so comforting and so wrong. Because once the pattern becomes visible, it becomes a variable in everyone's model of the future. And here's the worst part. At this stage, you don't need a definitive break to trigger consequences. You only need uncertainty. Which brings us to the acceleration paths. 3 of them, none of them clean. From here, you can see 3 paths, not predictions, paths. 1 is adjustment. Institutions absorb the shock, courts hold some lines, oversight returns unevenly through elections and procedure. The system survives, but changed. More cautious, more brittle, still functional. The second is erosion, not a collapse, a thinning. The rules remain, but enforcement becomes selective. Independent bodies learn to anticipate pressure. Civic leaders resist only when their own interests are threatened. The public adapts to the narrowing until it feels normal. And then there's rupture. That's when the gap between fast power and slow accountability becomes too wide to bridge peacefully, when every side assumes the other will use the state as a weapon, so they rush to do it first, when legitimacy stops being shared and becomes factional property. Notice what's missing from all 3 paths. Comfort. Because the deciding factor isn't a single court case or a single election. It's whether the country treats this pattern as just politics or as a structural change in how power moves. And that brings us to the ending we don't get to resolve because it's still being written. So here's the unresolved warning. A system can survive scandals. It can survive bad leaders. It can even survive violence. What it can't survive, at least not as a democracy, is a permanent upgrade to state power with no matching upgrade to accountability. Because once the government learns it can move fast when it punishes and slow when it explains, the incentive is obvious. Use the fast tools. Dare the slow ones to catch up. And if the people with the loudest voices only stand up when their portfolios feel threatened, if outrage is reserved for the moments that rattle Wall Street, then the system doesn't correct. It stratifies. Some people get protection. Everyone else gets exposure. That's not a single event. That's a new operating system. So don't treat this as something you can glance at once a week. Follow the pattern. Track the tests. Watch the silences. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because the next video is where we map the pressure points, exactly where this system either holds or gives. And until we know which, the danger stays what it is: quiet, routine, unfinished.